Hello, Why Religion friends. John Hilton here. About a year ago, I was blessed to be at the Western Wall on a Friday night to welcome in the Sabbath. As you may recall, in the Jewish tradition, Sabbath begins on Friday at sundown and goes until Saturday at sundown. So if you ever are in Jerusalem on a Friday night, I definitely recommend going to the Western Wall, where you'll find hundreds of Jewish people gathering together to welcome the Sabbath. There was singing, dancing, scripture study. It was an incredible atmosphere. It made me think about myself growing up. On a Sunday morning, was I singing and dancing so excited to welcome the Sabbath? Honestly not. And I realized that there was a lot I could learn in my life right now from these individuals who were so focused on celebrating the Sabbath. I went up to one young man and started talking to him about his life. He grew up in a very traditional Jewish home, and their family rules around the Sabbath were way strict. As he was telling me about the different traditions that they had, I said, well, when you were 14 or 15, were you tempted at all to rebel against these rules? And he looked at me as though I was from another planet. And he said, why would I rebel against the Sabbath? I love the Sabbath day. It's a day of joy, a time to reflect on my relationship with God. I walked away from that conversation with the distinct impression that I could learn a lot more about making the Sabbath a holy day from this young man and his friends.
We're not alone in this, right? We're not the only ones trying to maintain Sabbath or the only ones trying to maintain religiosity or a religious belief in a world that seems to, have a kind of combative approach to it sometimes. We have partners in this, and we've had partners who lived 1,000 years ago, and we have partners who are living today. And so the conversation, I think, is so important for us because we may not do exactly what they do, right? We may adopt some aspect, or we may learn from their approach, but it's not something that directly applies into our own religious practice. But it's that, what could they teach me that I don't know about yet? Or how do they do it better than I do? And that's a kind of humbling position.
How could our worship of the Sabbath day be enhanced as we look to faithful followers of God of a variety of faith traditions, both from past centuries as well as in contemporary society? That's the question we'll be exploring today. I'm your host, Professor John Hilton, and this is Why Religion.
Each year, religion professors at Brigham Young University produce hundreds of publications on subjects related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This podcast brings this research into one place to enlighten the everyday seeker of truth.
Seek learning, even by study and also by faith.
Interviewing the author, we discuss why the study was done, why it matters, and why the professor chooses to be both a scholar and a disciple. This is Why Religion. Research to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith in Jesus Christ.
Today we get to hear Jared Halverson interview his colleague Andrew Reed about his recent article, The Erosion of Sabbath Worship is Now Extensive, the imperative to learn holiness from other religious traditions. I'm excited for this discussion. Let's dive in.
Our colleague, Gay Strathern, recently edited a book called Sacred Time, The Sabbath as a Perpetual Covenant. It's a great book full of amazing papers from about a dozen or so BYU professors, our colleagues, and it discusses the Sabbath from all kinds of perspectives. The Sabbath in the Hebrew Bible or in the Synoptic Gospels as opposed to the Gospel of John, the Sabbath in the Book of Mormon, the Sabbath through early church history. It includes perspectives from early Christianity, Rabbinic Judaism. It's all over, and just a really rich resource for those that are trying to deepen their own understanding of the Lord's Day and the way that we can sanctify it and be sanctified by it. Now, you wrote a paper for this volume called The Erosion of Sabbath Worship is Now Extensive, the imperative to learn holiness from other religious traditions, which was a fascinating contribution to the topic. I'm curious, what was your aim in writing this paper, and why did you feel that this perspective, which was so unique compared to the others, was a needed voice in the conversation?
It's interesting because the topic wasn't one that I chose by myself. I was invited to contribute something in this vein, to think about the Sabbath and other traditions. Obviously, some of the other papers do this in some way historically, right? Thinking about Sabbath in the New Testament or Sabbath in Hebrew Bible, things like that. And my contribution was to think less about sort of the things that would be part of the Latter-day Saint canon and really think about what are other people doing in the world with regards to their observance of Sabbath. And so the invitation was made, and I was happy to take it on because it's something I've been thinking a lot about. How do other religious traditions, religions, how do their rituals influence us, historically? But more importantly, because we're in a world today where there's so much going on that's challenging religious communities and religious practice, I thought it would be helpful to sort of examine what a study of the Sabbath in other traditions might do to help Latter-day Saints better practice the Sabbath in our tradition. So it's designed really to kind of encourage a deeper sense of importance for the Sabbath for Latter-day Saints, but really it is also just an investigation of what could we learn. What are other people doing really well that we haven't picked up on yet?
I love that expansiveness and the openness to outside perspectives, the admission that we don't have a monopoly on understanding of this topic, and in fact, as Latter-day Saints, we're somewhat newcomers to the practice, and to stand upon the shoulders of giants from a history of Judaism and Christianity that has wrestled with similar issues for hundreds and thousands of years. Really is, as I read it, it really was an eye-opener. And in terms of trying to help a Latter-day Saint learn from our neighbors from other faiths, it worked for me. So I'm grateful for that.
Glad to hear that.
It's interesting. I'm fascinated by this. I'm fascinated by the topic of secularization, and I loved that at the beginning of your paper you discussed secularism and how it's impacted the ways people approach the Sabbath day. I'm curious as to why you went in that direction to start. You wrote that the perceived loss of a sense of holiness is cause for concern and deep reflection on what is lost when the Sabbath and the emphasis on sacred time more generally exists in the world. Could you speak more to that? Again, what brought you to this wrestle with secularization, and what do we lose when we lose a sense of sacred time?
Sure. I think in our modern context, when I talk to religious believers, people who participate in their communities, sometimes there's a deep fear that the world is eroding religion completely and it's going away and we'll lose it. And I think that's one kind of reading of secularization, that it's a zero-sum game, that we're going to lose it if we don't defend it completely. One of the things I think that's happening is more recently we're realizing that secularism isn't necessarily an enemy to religious existence and religious belief. As Charles Taylor says, secularism is a kind of statement about the reality that not everybody has to believe in our current context, right? Choosing to believe is one of several options. And I hope that as religious beings that we embrace that, to say that this is a choice, right? I'm not forced to believe. I'm not compelled legally or socially to believe, but I choose it. And I think there's an appreciation, at least in the way that I see it, of the modern world offers us many things. Every one of us operates in the secular world.
There's no avoiding that.
We go to a doctor and we depend upon science maybe to heal us, or we drive automobiles that are the result of science and engineering and all these things that are part of the secular. And I don't want to give those up.
Right.
But I also don't want to give up the possibility and really the opportunity for religious belief. For me, that matters.
Well, and amen. And in some ways, I think the topic of the Sabbath is such a perfect entrance into that wrestle, because it is this: how do I insert sacred time into a secular week? How do I carve out space so that I can connect with heaven and I can transcend the normal day-to-day kind of secular life? And I love what you said. And how do I make it a choice? So it isn't some kind of day of don'ts that's forced upon me. We're probably getting flashbacks from our childhood with that mental image. But this sense of I'm choosing to do things differently, and I'm given the privilege of carving out that space on a Sabbath. Back to I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question, though. What is lost when we completely abdicate sacred time and just turn our Sundays, turn our Sabbaths into holidays instead of holy days, just a long weekend kind of a thing. In your study and thought, what are we losing when we lose that sense of the sacred?
I think that sense of loss is real. If we were to abandon the sort of emphasis or the allocation of sacred time in our world, in our weekly, the things we're doing every week,
right.
I think we lose a sense of meaning. As religious beings, many of us connect what we're doing in the secular world on our, at our job, with our families. We connect it to a deeper sense of purpose, with a meaning behind our action. And for me, and I think for many people in the world, Sabbath is a chance to kind of sort of recalibrate or refocus. There's a need to kind of reposition ourselves in relationship to the holy. And the Sabbath allows us to do that. It's very, very easy in the modern world to just sort of perpetuate our activity in ways that doesn't create a space for pause or create a space to reflect. We can be inundated with activity, with technology, and it can absorb our time, and in the process, it absorbs our energy. And one of the things I like about the way that my friends in Judaism and other Christian traditions are thinking about Sabbath is it really is a moment of pause and reflection. And so you have to carve out time to do that. And if we don't allow that time, then we lose our sense of meaning, at least in the way that I understand what we're doing in our lives as human beings.
Well, to lose a sense of the sacred means to lose a sense of meaning. I completely agree. Let's get into some of the things that you brought up in the chapter itself that you've learned from these wonderful Jewish and Christian thinkers throughout history. Kind of rapid fire. I want to just quote something that you brought up in the book, and then if you could speak to that, see what are you learning from that statement? What can we learn from it? This first one comes from the Zohar, this Book of Radiance, which is a 13th century Jewish mystical text. And in it you quote this statement: "There are two commandments associated with the Sabbath day. The first is to observe the Sabbath, and the second is to accomplish the work of endowing that day with holiness." I'm especially fascinated by that second one. I think as Latter-day Saints, we observe the Sabbath. We try to keep it holy, but to keep it holy in a way that its sacredness is preserved, its holiness is being endowed by what we do. That was really, even the word endowed obviously picked up my ears. What would you say to that?
Yeah, that it is that second part that I think is so valuable and interesting for me, because for many of us, we understand the command to observe the Sabbath, right? Exodus asks us to remember it, right, and to keep it holy. So the Zohar is simply repeating that in a certain way, to kind of create a space for pause with our work, with the things we do in the world. But the harder task, I think, is to create holiness. In my home right now, I've got teenagers running everywhere, it seems like. And they're busy people. And every evening is homework or practices or whatever it is. And we get to the Sabbath, and sometimes it's just a point of exhaustion. And exhaustion
a day of rest by default.
Yeah, exhaustion doesn't bring a lot of holiness sometimes, right? And so one of the things that the Zohar's approach here and other texts are showing me is that we have to be intentional about it, that we need to sort of refocus our mind and our heart in preparation for the Sabbath. If we go into the Sabbath with just pure exhaustion and really just needing rest in the physical sense, we won't necessarily bring holiness into the equation. And we can't force holiness. I think it's developed through first observance, right? Maintaining a set of practices that are constant and consistent. but also there's a need for us to intentionally seek the holy. And that can be done in a lot of ways. And part of the reason that I think that particular quote got included in this chapter, and really the whole point of the chapter, is to create avenues for us to think about what does it mean to create holiness.
You bring a lot in from Judaism, which I'm so grateful for. This one comes from Talmudic sages, and they suggested that if people could keep 2 full Sabbaths properly, the Messiah would come. And that really struck me. You mentioned that Israel would have been saved and not ruled over because keeping the Sabbath is a fulfillment of all the commandments. And to think of that as the kind of, they all boil down into that one, that took me by surprise. And the thought of, can you just get it right twice? I'll come if you can do that.
Well, the Talmud and rabbis are, they've been so instrumental in helping us realize what's possible within Judaism. And I, for me, I find great value in their wisdom. Because in one sense, this is a critical statement. If you could just do it right twice, this would all be okay. But maybe it's not about getting it right. That idea of holiness is hard to say that was right, that when we create holiness, we can't force it. And so it's not meant to be, perfected as such. And one of the reasons that I love that idea is, we talk about trying to create holiness around our own Sabbath observance. It's really hard sometimes. Things get in the way. Children don't participate in that notion of we're creating holiness in the same way. But other things get in the way as well, right? Even our own Sabbath activities, with a very busy lay leadership in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that can have an impact on our sense of holiness.
Oh, yeah. With some of those kinds, I joke that the day of rest has now become a day of, I did everything I could during the week, and now I have to do all the rest. That's the rest.
But it's that idea.
About.
Maybe the rabbis are just simply saying that, this is something that's meant to be a perpetual covenant, as the subtitle of the book says, right? That we're meant to constantly do it. And perfecting it, that can mean a lot of things. And I don't think it will always mean the same thing to us at each stage of our life.
Great point. I get a sense from that and your discussion of it that it's like if we could simply carve out space where the Messiah feels welcome coming in, and he'll embrace the mess. That's what Jesus condescended to do, right? But to be able to come into our chaos because he feels welcome there, and we've tried our best to prepare for him. If that became consistent in our lives, no wonder the Messiah can come. We've proven that. Let me ask you another one. This one comes from Islam. And you mention a quote from the Quran where God instructed Muhammad that when the call to prayer is made on the day of assembly, hurry to the remembrance of God and leave business aside. That is better for you if only you knew. And the ending of that was what struck me. It's like, oh, what am I not knowing here?
Yeah. Well, many of my students, when they read Quran, for example, find it so insightful because it's telling the same stories they've read about in the Bible in some ways, but they're kind of told in a new key. And sometimes that's the value of learning from another tradition is it will be telling you something you already know and something you believe and something you maybe even do, but it tells it in a new way and it sort of forces us to pause, right? And so for me, this passage from Quran is, it's that idea of hurry, right? Put some emphasis on this. To me, there's that sense of urgency for the Sabbath, right? We talk about peace and rest and, kind of recovery on the Sabbath. But what happens if we have an urgency about getting to the Sabbath, about preparing for it so that we can embrace the holiness, embrace the peace? I think there's something beautiful in that, right? That the call to prayer in Islam is very regular, right? You're being called to prayer multiple times a day, and that call is an invitation to embrace what is holy, to seek holiness, and even in a world that's chaotic and broken, sometimes it's a moment of peace.
Yeah, well, and especially to interrupt the chaos with that moment. Mm-hmm. That was one of the things that struck me. I did a semester in Israel as a student years ago, and to hear the Muslim call to prayer was such a beautiful moment. I love the sound, but that it comes not at your choosing. right? And so this sense of hurrying to it, as you said, the imam calls and you better come running, right? And so you drop what you're doing, you stop, and to allow that sacredness, that holiness to interrupt your day repeatedly, and allowing in a bigger picture, allowing the Sabbath to interrupt your week in similar ways.
The out-on at 4:30 or 5 in the morning is sort of a disruption to many of our sleeping patterns. But it's such a welcome invitation, right? To start your day in a place of holiness, right? And the place doesn't really matter as such, but the space that we create for holiness, I think, is so important.
Yeah, creation of sacred time. That's beautiful. Let me ask you this one. Let's go back to Christianity now, early Christianity, St. Augustine, who said, "The seventh day has no evening and no sunset, because you have sanctified it to abide eternally." Could you speak to what Augustine's trying to get across there?
I wish I knew, but I do think there's a couple of things that stand out to me, at least. And if we just for a second talk about Judaism, one of the things that for Christians is so interesting about the Jewish Sabbath is it begins on Friday evening, right, as the sun goes down, as the sun sets, and then it ends on Saturday evening as the sun sets. And so the idea of holiness transcending even through the darkness, I think, is to me really meaningful, right?
Yeah.
That it's meant to be dark sometimes, and that's an opportunity to kind of bracket this moment in time, that we pause. And we know when it ends and when it begins. Teenagers in my house don't always know when Sabbath begins and ends. Sometimes it's when they arrive at church. Sometimes it's when they wake up. Sometimes it's when they get home at midnight. It changes, and there isn't a kind of clear marker. But then Augustine does something interesting in this, which is to say that the Sabbath is meant to abide eternally. Maybe there's two interpretations of that, or probably more. But one of them is simply the idea that the Sabbath is always here. Right? It comes every week. We know it's coming. It doesn't go away. We don't have Sabbath that don't appear. It's just here. Every week we have a Sabbath in both Judaism and Christianity. So I think that matters, right? That it's meant to be with us even as we travail, our human existence. But at the same time, the Sabbath, as taught in the Hebrew Bible, as taught in the New Testament, in Restoration Scripture, is really an opportunity, an invitation to eternity. It's a reminder of kind of the creative act. It's a reminder that in all of the things we're doing, right, to use the biblical kind of story of creation, God pauses at some point during this creative process. And I think that's an invitation for us to be attached to eternity, even while we're not.
That's a great way to put that. That's beautiful. And to attach to eternity, I guess, requires some. Is it unattached? To unattach from the cares of the world.
A little bit. This is part of why studying Jewish Sabbath practices is to me so insightful, because there really is a kind of solid break. You're not cooking. You're not necessarily cleaning up the mess that you made from the meal. You're really taking a hard pause from those kinds of activities. And they're different for every one of us. This is part of, in the Mishnah, which is a 2nd century Jewish text. It offers an insight here in the first part of the tractate on Shabbat. It says that, how you observe the Sabbath or how you prepare for the Sabbath will depend a little bit on who you are and what you do in the world. It will talk about a tailor, right? And a tailor won't take their needle out on Friday afternoon, because that's a form of their work. And, of course, you go over to your friend's house and there's an invitation. Hey, could you just mend my jacket real quick, right? And all of a sudden you're working through the beginning of the Sabbath. But that's different than, the Mishnah also cites a scrivener, someone who writes things. And in the 1st and 2nd century, that's an important job. But they don't take their pen. They can take all the needles they want, right? Because they're not equipped to do anything with them. Yeah. So I think there's a personal reflection here that we have to kind of be aware of and say, okay, so what are the things that I do, right? Because if we were to follow that same line of thinking, I mean, you teach Scripture, every day of the week, it seems, right? And so what do you do on the Sabbath? Well, then by that judgment, you shouldn't be teaching Scripture. You should be pulling away from that. And that's probably not what we're actually going to do, right? But it's how do you approach your teaching on the Sabbath that's different than what you do maybe here at BYU in the classroom or something like that. So it's a personalized approach to think about, what do we do on the Sabbath? What are the things that I need to think about that may be different than my neighbor?
If you're interested in more high-quality gospel scholarship, check out BYU's Religious Studies Center. The RSC recently released Faith and Politics by Richard Davis, BYU Professor of Political Science. While the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has declared political neutrality, they have also urged individual members to actively participate in the political process, become informed about issues, and choose candidates who demonstrate compassion and integrity. This book features 25 interviews with active Latter-day Saint politicians across multiple countries and political parties. Through these interviews, Davis answers the question of whether faith and politics can coexist harmoniously. Faith and Politics is distributed by Deseret Book and available at rsc.byu.edu. We've been listening to Dr. Reed help us understand what we can learn from other faith traditions about honoring the Sabbath day. In Part 2, we continue the discussion and also explore how interfaith practices generally can help increase our discipleship.
You quote Rabbi Heschel as saying this: "To gain control of the world of space is certainly one of our tasks. The danger begins when in gaining power in the realm of space, we forfeit all aspirations in the realm of time. There is a realm of time where the goal is not to have, but to be, not to own, but to give, not to control, but to share, not to subdue, but to be in accord." What was Rabbi Heschel teaching us there?
Well, Heschel teaches us a lot of things. As you know, I'm a real fan of Abraham Joshua Heschel, and he writes this beautiful little book called The Sabbath. And it really is an investigation in the mid-1950s of how can Jews better observe the Sabbath as a way of maintaining Judaism as a lived practice. And in this particular quote that you mentioned here, I think his invitation is for us to become partners with God in one sense, right? That we aren't meant to control things. God's in control. We're meant to partner and help in that cause, whatever that may look like. But at the same time, we're very good at creating what we call sacred space. We build chapels, cathedrals, mosques, synagogues, right? And these become kind of the edifice by which we pursue the holy. And what Heschel's saying is that we can build all the structures that we want, but until we allow ourselves to pause for that time, to let time be what's sacred, showing up in a sacred space doesn't mean that we're doing anything really that's going to amount to holiness. For Latter-day Saints, of course, we're invited to think about holiness, to participate in it, to invite it. But just because I go to my own church services on Sunday morning, I can go and I can sit there and basically do nothing. Mm-hmm. But I went to the sacred space. And I think for those moments to mean more to us, to be seen as something truly sacred or holy, it's about the preparation on both ends of that. What we do before we show up there and what we do after that will make that moment seem different, right? I think that's what matters. And Heschel is asking us to say, don't always worry about creating the space, right? Allocate yourself the time that will let you reflect.
What it amazes me, that's such a profound insight, especially in this day of such rapid temple construction, right? And President Nelson gets up every general conference and seems to announce 20 more somewhere in the world.
And it's exciting, isn't it?
It totally is, and to the point that you get these oohs and ahs and the gasps in the conference center of, wow, we're going to create sacred space in that part of the world. And can you imagine President Nelson standing up each week and saying, and we're going to create sacred time again this Sunday? right? And would there still be oohs and ahs, or is it an eye roll? Well, like, what? Creating sacred time? What are you talking about? So I love what you've brought to the table with the help of Rabbi Heschel, that time deserves our attention just as much as space does.
Well, and I think we sometimes skip over those invitations, right? About a decade ago, which I think is where the thought behind this book actually began. Church leaders were inviting us to think about our time, right? And there's been developments over the course of that decade. At first, it was kind of instruction about what does the Sabbath mean? Why is it important? What are things we can do to encourage greater, sacredness or holiness during this day? But then we saw, not too long ago, maybe 5-6 years ago, a different invitation, which was, we're going to change the way you have practiced church for several decades. Like the amount of time you spend in the sacred place, we're going to change that. So you're now going to spend more time at home. We're going to invite you to read Scripture differently with your family and personally, individually, in preparation for what happens there, but also just to deepen your well.
It's amazing that all of this has been growing out of conversations from the likes of the Jewish Zohar and the Quran and Augustine and Heschel, and have invited them in to the conversation. I think you've proven your point in this article that we can learn from those outside our specific religious tradition. If we could speak to that more broadly, that's one of these great added blessings of this approach. We get to learn and treasure the Sabbath more deeply because our cloud of witnesses has expanded. And again, people that we might not normally learn from, speaking of intentionality, you've intentionally brought them into conversation, and it's really deepened my understanding. I'm so grateful for that. So speaking more generally of this kind of interfaith dialogue, for lack of a better term, what value have you found, not just in terms of the Sabbath, but in general, what value have you found in learning from people outside of our own faith?
The way you put it there, that I've invited them into the conversation, in some ways I feel like I've been invited into their conversations,
Wow,
right?
Well said, well said.
Some of these writings have been here for a couple thousand years. And so I think one of the realities is that for me, there's a kind of required sense of humility when I think about what the religious answers that I know, and I think about the fact that there have been religious people in the world for thousands and thousands of years, and they've been thinking about the same things I'm thinking about, the questions that we have, the challenges we face, right? Maybe in a different key, but still there. And that invitation to learn what they've learned is helpful. It creates a sense that, we're not the only ones worried about these things. And that in conversations with other religious communities in the world that I've had a chance to participate in, one of the great blessings of that is that I realize we're not alone in this, right? We're not the only ones trying to maintain Sabbath or the only ones trying to maintain religiosity or a religious belief in a world that seems to, have a kind of combative approach to it sometimes. We have partners in this, and we've had partners who lived 1,000 years ago, and we have partners who are living today. And so the conversation, I think, is so important for us because we may not do exactly what they do, right? We may adopt some aspect or we may learn from their approach, but it's not something that directly applies into our own religious practice. But it's that, what could they teach me that I don't know about yet? Or how do they do it better than I do? And that's a kind of humbling position.
Well, and I think, speaking of humility, it does require certain Christ-like attributes to keep us open to that, to recognize that other people may be doing certain things better than we do. And it's the holy envy that Krister Stendahl talks about. And somehow you have developed those attributes. And I love seeing you work with interfaith groups. I had the privilege of joining you for one of them last year, and just to see your approach, your spirit, your personality coming through, that you love this, that this is something that. So can I ask you a selfish question?
Sure.
Yeah, this is not one that I had planned on bringing up, but I've been wrestling with a verse in Ephesians chapter 1, where it says that in the dispensation of the fullness of times, and that phrase alone captures a Latter-day Saint's attention, thinking, okay, if we're the custodians of the dispensation of the fullness of times, that verse in Ephesians 1 says that in that dispensation, we are to gather together in one all things in Christ. And the thought that I've been wrestling with is, as Latter-day Saints, if we are helping lead the charge in this final dispensation, it doesn't seem like it's our job to possess all the truth originally, but rather to gather together all the truth that God has ever revealed to any of his children at any age and any place. And I see so much of what you do intellectually, academically, in your teaching, in your research, gathering. I mean, you did it in this paper. You're gathering together insight from across the ages to help inform our understanding of the Sabbath. Could you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I think it's, I don't know that I have all the answers for this, but I think one of the kind of valuable lessons that I've learned is that, we do hold truths. We have truths that mean a lot to us and that help us understand the world we live in and the purposes of what we're doing as Latter-day Saints. But if ours are the only correct answers, I think we're in trouble. There are other people who just have thought about this a lot longer than we have. And for me, there's something beautiful about thinking, what have they done? What are the changes they've made historically that might help me understand kind of where we're at right now? And so to me, that's a beautiful kind of way to think about it, is that we're not the only ones out there with answers. We do have answers. And I think that's important to remember, right? That just because we find a different answer doesn't mean our answer is wrong. Or we may even find answers that contradict ours. But somewhere in the middle of those is probably where that tension is for us. But also the invitation to really think about the truths that we hold, and to recognize when other people have truths that could teach us something.
This is beautiful. I'm picturing listeners out there, some of whom are nodding with a huge smile on their face, like amen, amen. Picture those that have friends of other faiths and that they've learned from and have these rich interfaith relationships and so on. For those that might be wrestling with this, though, of I want that, I don't know how to get there, or how do I open myself to the truths that others can bring to the table without clearing my table entirely to start? Any advice you'd give to those?
Well, I think, it's a really important question, and it's one that isn't, it's not easy to answer because it's personal in some ways. Some people just have a different attitude, and that's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a different attitude, right? That some people are happy to kind of go into places where they're learning a lot from another tradition. And for some, that creates a tension to say, am I losing my truths? And other people are kind of more comfortable there. And so I think one of the things that we can do, and it's really not a brilliant insight at all, but it's just have conversations, right? Be willing to have conversations and to listen, right? Hear what other people do, hear what they believe, without the idea that I then need to tell them what is true, right? Or what is right, or to correct their beliefs in any way. Just allow them to share what they know, right? And to allow them to share their experience. This is one of the great kind of mysteries to me, is that, we have all these religious communities out there, and they're encouraging people to do all kinds of things that are good and noble in the world. And we sometimes forget that people are having experiences, right? Spiritual experiences even with God in these traditions. And then I think about, what about a Latter-day Saint who's having a religious experience of some kind, or, increasing their spirituality along the way? Does that mean that one of them is the right way to do it and the one's the wrong way to do it? I don't know, right? I mean, I think there are truths that for me as a Latter-day Saint mean a lot. And there's a pattern to religious life that helps me, I think, stay grounded in some ways to what I believe to be true. But there's a big invitation out there to say, what is someone else experiencing that might help me even process my own experience? It's not easy. Christopher Sendall said, seek first to understand, right? Start there. Just tell me about your story. Tell me what you do, what you like about your tradition, without me then having to say, now let me tell you my message, right? Maybe that comes up, and hopefully it does at some point, but the relationship could easily be built just by saying, tell me more about who you are, what you do. And don't be afraid to just visit another sacred site. Right? The invitation's always there, it seems. So,
if you're interested in reading Dr. Reed's article, The Erosion of Sabbath Worship is Now Extensive, the imperative to learn holiness from other religious traditions, we've been able to place a link to it in our show notes and on our website, whyreligion.byu.edu. Please note that due to copyright agreements, it's available for free for a limited time only, so check it out now. I also recommend you go back to episode 21 of Why Religion and listen to Professor Reed's episode on Rose Marie Reed. She's not related to him, just so you know. Rose Marie Reed both revolutionized women's swimwear and also worked with senior church leaders to improve missionary work. It's a fascinating story. But for now, it's time for our last segment, part 3, where we get a little more personal. Here, Andy shares some of his personal experiences with interfaith exchanges and how they have strengthened his faith in Jesus Christ.
The last interview that you did on Why Religion, you talked about your educational background, some of your professional experiences, which were so fascinating. If we could get even more personal this time, especially the kinds of spiritual experiences that have shaped you to become such an open-hearted disciple of Christ. I mean, just as firm in the faith as you can get, but also so beautifully open to those outside the faith. How has the Lord prepared you for this kind of ministry, to put it that way?
Well, I don't know that I have the best answers here. I think in some ways, it's easy to say, well, it just sort of happened. It's just how I'm, kind of predisposed to the world. And I don't know that that's true, because I do believe that that we can learn how to do this. And it's something I'm continuing trying to learn. I was in London last week, and Archbishop Angelos of the Coptic Church in London told about his community, how in difficult times when it was being persecuted, there was kind of closing in on ourselves, right? We kind of seek isolation in ourselves. And he said, I'm not sure that was the best pathway forward, because it closed us off, but it also kind of stagnates community sometimes. And so there's a kind of beautiful kind of relationship that can develop as I have to know my own tradition. I have to study it. I have to participate in it before I think I can really do this well. Some of my friends always say that they really want to participate in interfaith dialogue with people who really believe what they believe. Yeah. And that's encouraging to say that, it's not about converting each other in these spaces. There are spaces where conversion is central, right? I have a son that's on a mission, a Latter-day Saint mission right now, and he's out there trying to teach people the message he knows. And that's valuable and important, and I think we have opportunities to do that. Sometimes there's a slightly different approach in the way that we talk about the truths that we hold in interfaith settings. And there's a kind of response that's required of us to just allow things to be sometimes. For me, I watched this happen in a really beautiful way this past summer. We had students with us at Cambridge University at the Wolf Institute, which is an incredible interfaith sort of training space and research center. And our students were invited to participate in a Shabbat dinner on Friday evening. And it was being led by Dr. Emma Harris, who was working with our students during the time that we were there. And she shared this with BYU students when she came here recently, kind of the background to that. So her parents passed away. She grew up Orthodox in the Jewish community. Her parents passed away within about a year of each other, just a year ago. And so for her, she's never led Shabbat dinner, prayers, or celebration of any kind, because traditionally it would be a male who does that. And she did it for the first time with our students. And she felt like it was the interfaith space that opened up that opportunity, where she was teaching us about the way she observed Sabbath. And it was so beautiful to hear her sing and pray and just talk about what Shabbat means for her. And it was a kind of beautiful reminder that sometimes changing the setting helps us change the way we think about something, or even allows us to think about it differently and to act differently in that space. So there's something beautiful about that, right? But I also think about the moments in my own life when, Sabbath observance has been very, very chaotic and maybe unholy, and Sabbath observance has been deeply moving and personal and inspiring and restful. And it's really hard to tell what the difference was sometimes. Maybe it's just maybe it's luck of the draw some days. But I think it's also, that if we can prepare ourselves properly, holiness will come. We can't force it, but it does encourage us to say, I can do things that will allow myself to be in the right mindset, the right kind of place, so that those feelings of holiness may happen.
Well, it sounds like you're giving your students ample opportunity for those kinds of moments of holiness to occur in their lives. If I could ask you along those lines, because I know you do a lot of work with students here at BYU, taking them abroad, as you just described, and inviting other people to come here onto this campus and meet with students. Briefly, what's your ideal outcome there? What do you hope will happen in your students' lives by engaging in these kinds of interfaith experiences?
It's such a hard question to answer, because as teachers, I think we're driven, by the places we work and the kind of mechanisms that we have for teaching. We're driven by outcomes, and we want to say a student will be able to do this, or a student is now able or equipped to perform this skill or this task. And interfaith is weird like that, right? That there are dispositions and approaches that we can learn, right? We can learn how to ask good questions. We can learn how to listen. We can gain a kind of religious literacy that lets us understand another community just by studying a book or, having a conversation where they teach us something. Those are all learnable skills and capacities. But ultimately, the outcome for me that I really hope students and anybody who wants to kind of think about this, the outcome is different. It's a change in respect for religious belief and religious practice in the world. It's a kind of appreciation. And I think that's a capacity that just sort of develops over a long time, because when we first go into a new space or we first learn about something new, it's uncomfortable. It's different. It's foreign in some way. Maybe we don't even have the right vocabulary to talk about it. But then we spend enough time learning about it that becomes a little bit more familiar. And we're no longer sort of tethered to the uncomfortable parts of it, but we're able to kind of participate fully in it in a way that's inspiring, right? And it's a kind of appreciation. And that's where, I don't know how to get students to that point, right, or anybody else to that point. I think it's just time. And there will be uncomfortable moments, right? I mean, I've got dozens of stories of my own moments when it was deeply uncomfortable because you're trying to be a good host to someone from another faith, or you're trying to be a good guest, or you're just trying to have a good conversation. And we stumble sometimes. And those moments, they're going to happen. It's okay, right? So the outcomes, I think, is about a disposition and attitude more than anything else, an openness to learn.
I love that. Well, if I could ask, this has been such a beautiful interview, Andy. I really, for my own sake, thank you for letting me be a conversation partner and just learn from you so directly. If I could ask one last personal question of you, because you did mention it takes time, and you've taken that time. Your life has been spent in these kinds of endeavors, and it's shaped you into who you are. And what a gift to the kingdom to be able to bring those kinds of attributes and abilities and expertise. What effect has it had on you spiritually? In terms of whether it's keeping the first great commandment more intently or the second great commandment more naturally, how has your lifetime of interfaith work shaped you spiritually?
To me, there's the invitation to learn about other people's experience is a holy one. You think about how uncomfortable it can be to kind of share the most deeply personal spiritual things that you experience in the world with someone else. Sometimes we're very selective about who we share those with or when we share them or how we share them. And in one sense, I've been very fortunate because, of the place I work and the job that I have here, I get to spend my time doing this. Not everybody has that privilege. And so I do see this as sacred work. And I think it's important. It aligns in some ways with the invitation to build peace, right? To deepen relationships. And really for me, maybe the biggest lesson I've learned is that there's a humanity that exists in the world that I can't fully understand, but I can certainly learn something from. One of the things that we sometimes do is we over-pressurize this interfaith space, to say, oh, this is high stakes. If I do this wrong, I'm going to do something bad. And I really want to disabuse us of that sense. I think that my experience has been, both in hosting people of other traditions and being hosted by them, there's a kind of generosity of spirit that people possess that they recognize when we don't know what we're doing, right? It's on us to prepare to do it well, but people are very kind, especially in these interfaith spaces, because we tend to get people who are thinking on these lines and interested in it. And even when it's uncomfortable, it can be enriching and inspiring. And so for me, this article that I had a chance to write was really to say, what have I learned? What inspires me? What can I add to the sort of well that we're building? So to me, there's just a lot that we can learn and a lot that needs to be learned. But as I said earlier, I think it really depends upon our own investment in our own tradition, because otherwise we lose the meaning behind it, right? Part of the reason that I enjoy doing this kind of work and enjoy reading other people's sacred text and understanding their rituals is because it deepens my own experience with my tradition. And I think that's important to remember, that we can't say, oh, I do interfaith, therefore I don't need to know my own tradition. No, we probably need to know our own tradition better. And so it's an invitation to really dig into our own tradition, to our own scripture, to our own prophetic statements, and really understand what they're saying, and recognize that there's something else we can learn as well that will not just add to this well of knowledge, but will add to our capacity for understanding the holy and feeling the holy and participating in eternity.
Thanks for listening to Why Religion. This podcast is a production of religious education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. My name is John Hilton, the host and producer. The Why Religion podcast team also includes from BYU Religious Education, Professors Jenna Erickson, Casey Griffiths, Jared Halverson, Travis Searle, Ryan Sharp, Hank Smith, and Brad Wilcox. Promotional materials were created and distributed by Leanne Kopis and Katie King. Recording, mixing, and original music was done by BYU students Alec Galloway and Ethan Arkell. Original music and scoring for the Why Religion podcast was also created by the fabulous BYU student musicians Grant Cagle,
Sam Clausen,
Colette Jones,
Alistair Scheuermann.
If you enjoy what you've heard, please like and subscribe to Why Religion and leave us a rating. This really helps others discover the podcast. And join us next time as we continue to bring the everyday Latter-day Saint fascinating gospel studies done by BYU religion professors to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith in Jesus Christ.